Hello and welcome to the nuts and bolts of systematic reviews. My name is Ivan Portillo. I'm the pharmacy librarian at MB Ketchum Memorial Library, and today I'll be speaking about systematic reviews, but also about the expansion of evidence-based practice that has led to an increasing variety of review types. Some of the other common review types are literature narrative reviews, rapid reviews, umbrella reviews, and meta-analysis. The diversity of the terminology used for these review types has resulted in confusion and sometimes misapplied terms. So what I'll be talking to you about today is what is a systematic review, understanding the importance of a systematic review, the difference between some of the most common ones that we hear about lately, a literature review, systematic review, and meta-analysis, and the steps required to complete a systematic review. So let's begin by defining what is a systematic review. There are multiple definitions about what is a systematic review, which may aid to add to the confusion and misapplied terms when discussing this review type. Let's start with one definition here on the left. A properly conducted systematic review faithfully summarizes the evidence from all relevant studies on the topic of interest, and it does so concisely and transparently. Some of the key terms we see here are that it summarizes the evidence from all relevant studies. So it tries not to skip on any case studies or trials that are maybe out there. And it does so in a concise and transparent manner, which we'll discuss later why it's so important in order to avoid bias. Here on the right, we have another definition. A review of a clearly formulated question that uses systematic and explicit methods to identify, select, and critically appraise relevant research and to collect and analyze data from the studies that are included in the review. So, a clearly formulated question means that the researcher has developed a question based on an interest, and they're following a guideline which tells them how to systematically and explicitly identify what they're researching based on methods as defined in the guidelines, which we'll speak about later. So this is my just personal definition um, from looking at different guidelines and different articles that define a systematic review. So in my opinion, a systematic review follows guidelines in order to systematically identify, select, assess, and synthesize any relevant research in order to show what is known and not known about the potential benefits and harms of drugs, devices, and other medical treatments. So why are systematic reviews so important? Well, systematic reviews are essential for any clinician who's looking to integrate evidence-based medicine and research findings into their daily practices. So if you want to use data and previous research findings into your daily practice, then systematic reviews are very helpful and important. The story behind the very first systematic review kind of reveals the importance of this review type and evidence-based medicine in general. The Cochrane collaboration, their logo actually is the first systematic review that really showed the benefit of this evidence-based method. Um, this actually is a forest plot here, and each little horizontal line represents a single clinical trial here. And in this case, there were randomized controlled trials, and the shorter each line is, the more certain the result is. And the diamond represents the combined results of all these trials. If the line were to fall right on this vertical line right here, it indicates that there was no effect to the treatment. But if the lines were drifting more toward the left, it means that the treatment showed a more positive effect. If they were going more toward the right here, then that means the treatment was more harmful. And this particular forest plot represents uh, the systematic review of a trial from 1972 to 1989. And the very first controlled trial from this forest plot is from 72, in which it reviewed the short course of an inexpensive drug, a corticosteroid, given to women expected to give birth prematurely. And the if what it found, what this forest plot finds, is that corticosteroids given to women expected to give prematurely reduce the odds of their babies dying from complications by between 30 and 50%. Now, there were no systematic reviews uh, previously to this finding, so most obstetricians didn't realize that this treatment was so effective until the systematic review was published in 1989. So even though there were 17 years of trials being found that this had a positive effect, um, it wasn't until a systematic review came around that you can quickly and concisely see the positive effect of this treatment. And so it showed that the quality of evidence behind the systematic review is truly worthwhile. And this is an evidence-based pyramid, and it indicates the higher the review type is on the pyramid, the higher quality of evidence. So you'll see at the top that systematic reviews or meta-analysis, they have the highest quality of evidence. And this is just my personal opinion of the evidence-based method pyramid. There are several others that have these higher or in different orders. Meta-analysis, they're often combined with systematic reviews, so they fall up here as well. Literature reviews and critically appraised topics would fall right underneath. And these are filtered information, so these are in combination of various results, so you can see why they're on top. While as randomized controlled trials or cohort studies, they're just one individual result, so you can see where why they would fall a little bit below, and they're unfiltered information. So what isn't a systematic review? Uh, I'll talk about literature reviews and meta-analysis because they're often, um, they're often misinterpreted as being systematic reviews. And a literature review, as defined here by Grant, a literature review involves identifying materials for potential inclusion, let's say to a publication, whether or not requiring a formal literature search, for synthesizing them in text, tabular or graphical form, and for making some analysis of their contribution or value. So essentially, a lit review identifies materials whether or not requiring a formal literature search. It looks to identify what has been accomplished previously, for building on previous work, for summation, for avoiding duplication, or for identifying any gaps on the topic. Now, this is very different than a systematic review because it may not require formal literature search. Um, and so a systematic review actually requires the identification of all sort of relevant materials in a systematic and transparent way. So it's very strict on that. And it also looks for the quality and validity of the studies, whereas a literature review may not include that. Literature reviews don't necessarily analyze the data of the study being identified. So they may look at the results, but they're not necessarily looking at the data, the methods of the studies being conducted. So that's why in systematic reviews, they look for that and they're looking for any bias between, let's say, a specific trial or case study on the author. So it's looking for the quality of the studies itself. So, and because systematic reviews look to include all relevant studies, um, any conclusions made by the authors of a literature review may be open to bias. It may be inadvertent, but since they may since they may omit certain literature and not check the quality or validity of these statements being made in the specific studies, that's where there might be some sort of bias um, in the literature review. Now, the other very popular review type that's often confused with the systematic review is meta-analysis. And the mesh definition in the case of meta-analysis is works consisting of studies using a quantitative method of combining results of independent studies, usually drawn from published literature, and synthesizing summaries and conclusions which may be used to evaluate therapeutic effectiveness, plan new studies, and etc. So a meta-analysis statistically combines the results of quantitative studies to provide a more precise effect of the results. And systematic reviews, while they do gather uh, the data from several individual studies, uh, and it'll combine those results in a statistical form, it may not be like the method that a meta-analysis does. And the main difference is that um, so if a meta-analysis will focus mostly on quantitative studies, and systematic reviews may look at qualitative studies as well. And and in systematic reviews, if appropriate, the final step will be a meta-analysis. But this is determined if the included studies of systematic review are sufficiently similar. So the studies in the systematic review must be similar in population, intervention, and outcome measurements and timing. They must be significantly similar enough in order to qualify a meta-analysis. But if they're not, then the systematic review can still show the results of the data, um, but just not in a meta-analysis. But ideally, a meta-analysis should be part of a systematic review, but that's not always the case. And a systematic review doesn't always need a meta-analysis, as I said earlier, to report its findings. So now that we've sort of looked at the difference between the three review types, between a literature review, a meta-analysis, and a systematic review, I wanted to take a look at some examples of what they may look like in an article. And they look very similar, but it's you can easily spot the difference between all three. And I'd like to show you the first example. And we'll only be looking at abstracts at this point, because you can easily spot the difference between the methods between all three. And in this case, we're looking at a narrative review. A narrative review is the same as literature review. Just very, again, it's that uh, the different review types, the different terminology, but it indicates the same review type, so it can create that confusion again. So the very first one I want to look at here, um, we'll all notice all these review types, they'll all have an objective here. Either it'll clearly state objective or it'll state it somewhere in the beginning, in the introduction or the background. So in this paper, they want to discuss the ethical consequences of the unprecedented integration of research and care in pediatric oncology from the perspective of parents and physicians. So what they did is they did a narrative review of primary qualitative studies. So they were looking at qualitative studies. They wanted to do a comparison between the research and then use the evidence and analyze sort of the concepts and gather an opinion on that. So this is again a literature review. So they analyzed 22 studies and they came to a conclusion based on what they read. And in this author's opinion, uh, future research should focus on efforts that overcome the problems that were found in the research. So this is as you can see in a literature review, they're coming to a conclusion based on previous studies, but you see that there's no mention of a method on how to choose the 22 studies that were reviewed. Not really too much mention of the data or evidence coming from these specific studies. And the conclusion isn't based on any statistical analysis of the data found in these studies as well. Now let's take a look at a systematic review now. Right away, again, there's an objective right here clearly pointed. And under the methods, you'll see that they specifically focused on these four databases. And one of the key things about a systematic review is that it really wants to be transparent on the methods it used to find its evidence and its trials and studies. And that's because they want to make it reproducible so that anybody can find this and anybody can find similar evidence to prove their point and to show that there wasn't any bias when selecting any of the articles they chose. So aside from the four databases, uh, the author here is also showing the criteria for what articles would be chosen for the final systematic review. In this case, they're discussing the outcomes of the treatment, the timing that they'd like to see in certain articles, and what you get are here in the results are that they ended up choosing 11 articles. The 11 articles came, uh, they ended up discussing over 224 patients. They're showing the age range, the sex of the patients. The majority are 59% men, and kind of what the effect of the treatment came out to be. Now, they also happen to show the limitations of these studies that they chose. So in this case, there was the majority were just observational reports, and they're indicating here that a lot of them were rather different. So because of the differences between the studies, they could not conduct a meta-analysis. So the conclusion, as you'll see, is based off the data that they found in the 11 articles. So they're making an assumption or a decision based on the criteria they set, but also the evidence that they found in the study. So you can see it's a bit different from the narrative review that we just looked at. So since they couldn't conduct the meta-analysis, let's take a look at an article with a meta-analysis here. Right away, you'll notice that this looks very similar to a systematic review. Again, there is an objective here, and to analyze the association between nutritional status and the outcome of dengue infection. And right here, you can see that they mentioned that they used 11 databases and manual searching for a reference list when identifying relevant studies. Now, they don't identify the electronic databases. They may do that later on in the study or in the publication. It just may not be included here in the abstract. But they discuss their method. They're also saying that two authors worked independently. So again, they're being very transparent. And again, their criteria. So including the studies must be classified into three categories: dengue fever, as you can see. So based on the criteria and their methods, they came up with 13 articles that met the inclusion criteria that they set before creating the review. Now you can see there's a lot more quantitative data here coming from the results or the effects of the treatment given. And based on the amount of quantitative data we found here, there was probably a high similarity between the articles the and the patients and the studies found. So that's probably what led to the meta-analysis being conducted. Now later on in the publication, you'd probably find a visual representation of the data, likely in the form of a forest plot. And that's what basically makes a meta-analysis from a systematic review. Okay, so I wanted to show you one more systematic review. And in this systematic review, there is no meta-analysis, but I wanted to compare it once again with the meta-analysis systematic review combination that we saw just right before. So in this systematic review, again, we see the objective right here, explaining what the review is on. In this one, we see again that they're conducting an online database search and they're describing which databases they searched, ScienceDirect and PubMed in this situation. But I wanted to point out in this one that they point out in their method that they conducted the review following a minimum set of standards as outlined by the PRISMA group. So the PRISMA group, they have a guideline on how to conduct a systematic review, which I will speak about in a little bit. It's good that they mentioned that as well, that they have inclusion and exclusion criteria for selecting their studies. Now, in the results, they don't have as much data being described, They don't mention how many articles there are, but later on they do mention how many they have selected. And I want to refer to this article later on because it does a good job of showing how they follow the guidelines and how to properly report uh, a systematic review. So we'll come back to this in a little while. But I want to touch on now on the basic steps of a systematic review. And for that, I won't go into too much detail because there are guidelines out there that give you the full detail on how to conduct each and every step of a systematic review. Here are four of the most popular ones that I've come across. The Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews of Interventions. Uh, so this one put on by the Cochrane Collaboration, and all these guidelines are free, by the way. They'll be online, and I'll provide links in an attachment. And the Cochrane is probably the most widely known and popular guideline. And while it is very specific and very detailed, there's no need to really follow the exact steps as described in the Cochrane Handbook. Only the only time you will need to follow each and every step is if you were to publish your review in the Cochrane database of systematic reviews. The next one, the Institute of Medicine, they created their guideline called Finding What Works in Healthcare: Standards for Systematic Reviews. PRISMA, as we saw in the other systematic review, it stands for the Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analysis. And then the HRQ, Methods for Guide for Effectiveness and Comparative Effectiveness Reviews. So all of these have their pros and cons, but you may follow each of these guidelines and they'll give you the proper procedure to conduct a systematic review. It's important to follow some of these guidelines, and if you do and then you end up publishing a systematic review, it's important to disclose which guideline you followed, as it'll make it easier to see if you conducted it a little slightly different than other systematic reviews, or just to show your preferred method. Okay, so this is a illustration of the systematic review process, and this infograph is gives it, it clearly illustrates the very basic procedures of how to conduct a systematic review. So we'll see here at the top, it all begins with identifying the issue and determining the question. So that basically means creating the research question. So basically, what's going to be your objective? What are you going to research? From there, you'll write a plan for the review, or what is known as a protocol. And the protocol is where you detail out um, every single step that, or basically every method that you'll go into when actually doing the systematic reviews. So basically, what will be your exclusion, inclusion criteria? What are some of the databases you plan on looking into? Um, you're basically writing out the plan of how you're going to conduct the review, and we'll go into much more detail of that in the next slide. From there on, once you have your plan set, you'll go out and actually search for some studies. And once you gather the great amount of articles and studies that are out there, you'll move on to sifting and selecting the studies. So you're going to sort them out based on your criteria. You're going to get rid of anything that isn't relevant. And then from there, once you have, let's say, your 11 or 13 articles, you saw in some of the other systematic reviews we saw earlier, it's not going to be 1,000 or 100 articles. It might be 11, 20, 30. So whatever fits your criteria that you set in your protocol. From there, you'll extract the data from the studies. You'll pick out the data. You'll assess the quality of the studies. Make sure that the studies that you selected are free of any bias, or um, you'll note the methods that the studies used. You'll combine the data, and then you'll discuss and conclude the overall findings. So from here, this is where you'll look at the data and then come to the conclusion of what you found. From there, you'll just write the systematic review and then disperse it. Now, a lot of people don't, they may see the simple process that we saw on the previous page, and they may say it's rather simple, but there's a lot of time committed to conducting a systematic review. This is just an example from the Cochrane Handbook. Um, their timeline that they give their researchers of how long they should expect to conduct a Cochrane review. Now, don't be too scared about all these month commitments here because some of these will be conducted by different people. Systematic reviews aren't conducted by just one person, they have a team. But the most important is the very first one, preparation of the protocol. Now, they recommend you spend 1 to 2 months preparing this protocol, and you'll want to make sure that you spend a lot of time on this because the protocol is what sets up the rest of the review. So if you don't spend enough time deciding how, let's say, how individual research will discuss when they don't agree on which study to select, or if they're excluding one study, uh, or let's say if you choose a certain age group for criteria, or if you just want studies from the past 5 years, but then when you conduct your search, you'll see that there aren't any studies within the last 5 years, then it's important to really prepare your protocol, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then you'll see that each one of these, their time kind of varies, and that's just because depending on the studies or depending on how large your team is, it all varies. So this is just to give you a time estimate. You can't do a systematic review within a month or two, in that fact, but you can also expect it not to last a full 2 years either. So this is just an estimate, but it's good to have this in mind when you're um, getting prepared to conduct a review. Okay, so the very first step when doing your systematic review is assess the need for one. So you'll need to confirm if there actually is a need for a need review. So one way of doing that is going out there and search to see if somebody else already has conducted a review on the topic you're interested in. You can look at the Cochrane Library to see what systematic reviews are out there. You could go on to Prospero. Prospero is a site where researchers submit their protocols and to put out there in a public review time of um, to show their intent of what review or topic they want to do a review on. So you could go on there, see if somebody's already interested in the topic you're looking to do a review. If there's already a lot on your topic, then maybe consider um, consider a different area of interest. So once you have your topic in mind, you've confirmed that there is a great need for that. It's time to assemble your team. And assembling your team is critical because they'll be the ones who will be supporting you. Now, you can't do everything at once, and that's because with systematic reviews, it's important to avoid bias. So it's important to have a team, and that begins with someone with relevant clinical or subject expertise, if that's yourself, or if you want another expert to help you with the review. Someone who knows systematic review methods. If this is your first time doing a systematic review, it might be helpful to find someone who can direct you or walk you through all the steps in more detail. And then an information specialist, which also may be a librarian, someone who can create the search strategy, guide you through which databases and key terms to use, and actually write out the search strategy is important. And then you'll need someone with expertise in statistics or quantitative methods if a meta-analysis will be conducted. Um, so all these members are really important to the review, and it's important to get as much help as you may need. Now, if you do decide to gather members for a systematic review, they should all disclose any conflict of interest or biases toward a certain conflict before joining. And from there, once you have your team, once you have the topic in mind, comes the next step of creating the protocol. Once again, this is very important to take your time with and describe in detail for the review to be successful. So from here, the very first step is to describe the rationale and context of the review. What's the reasoning behind the topic? Why are you conducting this review? You'll develop a research question. You can always use the PICO's or PICOT's method. So you'll focus on which patient population are you looking into, which innovation or treatment. Will there be a comparison where you compare it to another treatment or a placebo? What outcome measurements are you looking into, the timing and the study design if needed. From here, you'll define the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So exactly what outcome measures are you looking for, time points, interventions. So with these inclusion-exclusion criteria is for when you're looking for studies or selecting which studies to include in your review, what are you looking to include or what are you looking to exclude? So if you're looking for just a certain intervention or treatment, then you'll probably want to exclude anything unrelated to that. If you're looking for a certain population or age group at all, you can include that and then exclude everything else. So that's what this criteria will really help define the review and the studies that you select. From here, you'll do just a preliminary search strategy. So you'll quickly just see which databases will be relevant. Any limiters, say if you want like the past 5 years, if you have some key terms in mind, which are working, which aren't. This will evolve later. Perhaps you'll look for subject-specific websites, certain databases or certain journals that you'll want to hand search and such. So that's a step that you might want to work with an information specialist or librarian. From here, you'll describe the procedures for study selection. So we have two individual reviewers, three, four. If you have two, we have a third reviewer for any tiebreakers. This is usually conducted in two phases, but will you be doing it that way or not? From there, you'll describe the data extraction strategy. What data are you looking to extract? Are you looking to extract data such as adverse effects, population, treatment? What data will you be looking at? And what procedures will you be looking at for extraction? Are you going to put the data in an Excel file, an Access file, such and such? So here, in step 7, we'll describe the process for identifying and resolving the disagreement between researchers. So again, this is just further detail. You want to be upfront in case such a situation occurs. Describe the approach to critically appraise individual studies. So what are you looking for? Are you going to look for certain biases? If there is bias, how are you going to chart that? How are you going to describe that in your review? And then describe the method for evaluating the body of evidence, including quantitative, qualitative synthesis strategies. And finally, describe and justify any planned analysis of differential treatment effects. So you're just going very detailed about what you'll do in certain situations and how the review will be described um, and written. So, and then finally, describe the proposed timetable for conducting the review. So each of these 11 steps for creating the protocol, you can find in further detail in one of the previous guidelines that I showed you. So it's good to refer to those when you come into question about what this step 9 or step 10 really means. Once you have written your protocol, it's encouraged that you make it publicly available for any comment period. It's not required by most guidelines, but it is encouraged. Prospero is one site that you may submit it. It's also the site where I recommend that you go and look to see if there are any other systematic reviews similar to yours. And from there, once you submit, you can have a public comment period. So this is not required, but often encouraged. So now we move on to actually conducting the review. So once you have your protocol, you have the plan in place, we'll actually go into the process of doing what you plan out to do. So step 1 would be to find the evidence and document all your searches. So we're actually in the process now of looking for the studies and articles. So the first thing you'll do, and this is often done by an information specialist or librarian, is you'll create a search strategy. So that involves selecting the terms, finding the appropriate terms for the most relevant studies and articles to pop up in the database that you selected, whether it be PubMed or Embase, um, whatever database you chose. Uh, it's important to know which terms and which terminology is works best in those databases so you can get the most relevant articles and studies. Um, so you have to be sure to include all relevant resources, including either great literature or subject-specific websites. You may look at dissertations, conference abstracts, or even just going through journal and going issue to issue looking for any relevant documents or studies. Now, it's important to document each search that you conduct, either how many results you get from using one term or another, or what day you did the search. Um, this is to avoid any bias, or say if you're omitting any terms that may be relevant. From there, once you have an appropriate number of studies, or you believe you've covered all your bases, you'll screen and select the studies. The process of selecting the studies for your review is based off your inclusion and exclusion criteria from the protocol you wrote. There are usually two rounds of screening. Once is by either two reviewers. So what will happen is each reviewer will get all of the studies you retrieved from step one. They'll likely look at the title and abstract of the study or the article and quickly agree or disagree to include it into the review. So that would be by title and abstract. So two individual reviewers, just to remove any form of bias, because one may include one, and then the other reviewer might not include it. And then the second round will be whichever articles made it through the first round of screening. Say if you had 1,000 articles, and then in the second round there's only about 50. What will happen is the researchers or reviewers will acquire the full text article of the studies, and then once again they'll screen and select which ones are most relevant, based on criteria or otherwise, to be included in the review. This is usually documented using a flow diagram. So, as I mentioned, I wanted to refer to this systematic review, and because this has a very good example of a flow diagram. So as you can see here, they explain and they're open about their selection process. And initially, they identified 609 articles through the database search, which they documented and they show here in Table 1. From 609 articles, they also got 18 additional articles through other search methods, say if they found it through another journal, or let's say through a great literature or other format, they'll also want to include 18 articles. From there, they removed any duplicates. So say if there were duplicate articles in this 609 articles and then in these 18. From here, 608 articles were screened. 551 were excluded based on title relevance. So they went through the titles of the articles and excluded 551 based on their criteria. So that left them with 57 articles. They went through the full text of these articles, looking for if they would be eligible. 26 were excluded for reasons, various reasons, which might explain in an appendix or in another document. And so they were left with 31 studies included for this systematic review. So this essentially describes processes step 1 and step 2. Now, step 3 is extracting and managing the data. So now that you have, let's say, the 36 articles that they gathered, you want to grab the data and then so you can thoroughly analyze what these studies are discussing. So again, you can use two researchers to extract the data independently. based on your criteria, or what you put in the protocol that you wanted to extract from these studies. You can use Microsoft Excel or Access for inputting the data. So here again, referring to this article, here's one example of the data being extracted. Let me go ahead and rotate this for you. So what we have here are a table of each article and the data from the article. And you can see there was 36 articles here, several tables. We have the author and of each study. And what they did here was they included the study type, the intervention, the treatments, and then the cognitive effects. So while you may not have similar data to extract, just know that this is an example of what data you might want to look at. Um, you may not have this, instead of study type, you may have adverse effects or the patient population. You may not have cognitive effects, but you rather see, what other outcome measurements you may find. So that's just one example of the data extraction process as described in step 3 here. Okay, step 4, pardon me there. Step 4 is to critically appraise the quality of the selected studies. So you'll search for any risk of bias in this step, either systematic error, deviation from the truth in results, or inferences to the study. So once again, I want to go back to my systematic review example here. Now, the way this researcher wanted to display their bias, and pardon me for here, I just want to rotate this once again for you. And here we go. So you'll see right here that they have all of the studies they selected, and they have their bias, their risk of biases right here. So selection bias, performance bias, detection bias, and so on. And what they did is they used the key. So the green X means there's a low risk of bias, and then this tan colored X is unclear risk of bias, and then the X means a high risk of bias. So they analyzed each study and they determined what possible risks of bias there were in each study, which is it's a good method, and it's a good transparent and easily visual method to see what bias each study had. So that's one way of doing this, of step 4. Um, and if you may be wondering what the differences between each of these sort of risk biases are, the guidelines, Cochrane has a very detailed area for each of these biases, defining what they are and examples of what they may include. Data synthesis is once you've gathered the data, you've reviewed the quality of the studies. So now you'll determine, based on the data that you've extracted and received, if there is a possibility for a meta-analysis. So if so, you'll display those quantitative results either through a forest plot or other visual representation, and then describe the results, including any methodological results, characteristics, strengths and limitations, potential biases. So you're basically describing what you found in the results of each of these studies. And from there, you'll just simply write the report. You'll follow the standards or of the journal you're hoping to publish into, or the guidelines that we spoke about earlier. Typically, a systematic review will include an introduction, the method section, results, and then a discussion and conclusion. You likely won't find all of the documentation. Say when we did that search of the studies, we likely won't find all the key terms, the search strategies, and all that. That may later be documented in another publication, or maybe if it's online, they might include it as an option to see in an appendix and such, but likely not in the article. So from there, you will just need to update as needed, because As we saw that article from the systematic review from 1989, it may need updated now just to keep up with the changes in the treatments and any recent findings. If you have any questions regarding how to conduct a systematic review, feel free to contact me at iportillo@ketchum.edu, or you may just stop by the library at any time. I'll be attaching any handouts relevant to this presentation, so the links for each of the websites that I mentioned. I'll attach a document showing the difference between several review types, and I'll also attach the example systematic review article that I referred to a lot, just because I thought it would be helpful. And once again, I thank you for viewing my presentation, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.